The ontological argument for the multipersonal God is perhaps one of the best implications we have to suggest that there is a higher power out in the universe. In this video, I'll be helping to explain the ontological argument in the best terms that I possibly can to assist people in understanding it, for it is quite a complicated argument. Now, in order to understand the modal rendition of the ontological argument, I have to first go over its 4 axiomatic statements. An axiom is defined as a statement or proposition which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. The axioms of this argument are as follows. The axiom of properties, the axiom of possible worlds, entailment, and necessity. Additionally, we must also go over the 2 definitions of God. The first and original version would be creator theology, in which God is defined as all that is not God. The classical thought dictates that the only property this definition allows is for God to simply be God, and that God is indescribable. The alternative to this is perfect being theology, where God is a being purported to have all great-making properties in their maximal way, and all neutral-making properties in their maximal ways, whilst having no lesser-making properties. Both suggest that God is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent. However, because of the way modular logic behaves, only perfect being theology is compatible with this argument. The first axiom we're going over is the axiom of properties. The universe, or things that are found within it, are comprised or have properties. It can be divided into 3 different types. Great making, which is better to have than it is to lack. Lesser making, which would be the opposite, better to lack than to have. And neutral making properties, which are neither or both. Properties also exist in degrees. If something has the maximal extent of a property, it is the equivalent of having all of that property. If something has the minimal amount of a property, it is the equivalent of having the lowest value of that property. And if something lacks a property, the value of the property is simply 0 or null. It is important to note that just because something has a maximum of any property does not mean that nothing else cannot have that property. So an example would be if I had 100% of the strength, that then also means that something else can have more strength. Next is the possible world. In philosophy and theology, the possible world is a hypothetical state of affairs. When the phrase possible world is used, we're not saying that such a world actually exists, only that the state of affairs is what reality might be, or could be. This way we can see what ideas are valid and what ideas are not. If something is possible, then we say it exists in some possible world. The notion of the possible world is also found in the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum physics. However, because of the context of this argument, we don't need to address that until we talk about how a maximally great being exists in conjunction with the philosophical problems of omnipresence. For now, we'll simply focus on the philosophical version. A positive example of this axiom would be, in some possible world, Josh is wearing a red shirt. At the time of recording this, I'm wearing a gray one. So while the statement is not indicative of reality, there's nothing logically incoherent about that statement. I could be wearing a red shirt. And therefore, in some possible world, I am wearing a red shirt. A negative example of this would be, in some possible world, there are square circularities. Square circularities are not possible, and therefore not logically coherent, and therefore they occur in no possible world. Well, what does possible even mean? In the realm of logic, there are 3 different versions of what's possible. Anything that's deontologically possible presupposes what should be possible. Anything that is Epistemologically possible is what could be possible. And metaphysically possible simply focuses on raw logic in order to purport what is possible. But the language we use is also important. If we say something's possible, it has an even chance of occurring and not occurring. If something is probable, the chances of it occurring are higher than otherwise. If something is improbable, the chances of it occurring are lower. And if something is impossible, it has no chance of occurring whatsoever. And finally, our last two axioms. Entailment. If you have something, you must have something else. Shapes have size, therefore everything that has a shape has a size. And necessity. If something exists necessarily, then it exists in all possible worlds. Shapes, numbers, three-dimensional space, and the universal constants are all things that necessarily exist. And due to it being better to exist in all possible worlds than in just one, necessity is considered to be a great-making property. So the argument here is as follows. Premise 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise 2. If it is possible a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. Remember our axiom of necessity and the definition of a maximally great being. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being would have to exist in the actual world. Premise 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists, with the conclusion being that a maximally great being actually exists. This argument functions similar to an algebraic equation, with premises 2 through 5 acting as our given values, which are logically deductive via the axioms, and premise 1 acting as our x. Thus, all this argument needs to be given is a value for x. Or to word it back into the argument's terms, give a logically consistent reasoning for premise 1. Luckily for us, an individual by the name of Robert Modal provides one. This is our x value. Robert Modal's argument for premise 1 simply goes as such. If a property is a great-making property, its negation is a lesser-making property. Makes sense. The opposite of intelligence is stupidity. They negate each other. A great-making property cannot entail a lesser-making property. Again, makes sense. If something is great-making, how could it be so if it entailed flaws? And finally, maximal greatness is a great-making property. Hence, maximal greatness cannot entail its negation of non-maximal greatness. So what's the problem? If x is an impossible property, then everything has negative x. If everything has negative x, then all properties must entail negative x. Thus, if a maximally great being is impossible, then all things entail non-maximal greatness. If all properties entail non-maximal greatness, then all great-making properties would entail their contradictions. This violates the laws of non-contradiction as shown above. Thus, to assert that maximal greatness is impossible or doesn't exist is illogical. Therefore, the modal perfection argument is consistent when applied to the ontological argument and provides a proper value for x. Now let's go over some of our refutations. Richard Dawkins proposes in his book, The God Delusion, if God is the greatest possible being, would it not be better for God to not exist and still bring the universe into being? To answer him, would it be better? Possibly. But Richard Dawkins proposes that God exists whilst not existing. To put it in a way that would be more agreeable, if Dawkins was the best person to give this refutation, would it not be better for Dawkins to not exist and still give his refutation? What about a maximally great island, bird, or pizza, physical beings are dependent on physical space. As we know from modern cosmology, in the beginning, space existed as a singularity, infinite in density and curvature, thus no such being could exist as an island, bird, or pizza. How do we know there's only one? If multiple beings are omnipotent and their wills come into conflict, the logical fallacy follows. If one of them... I give purple water as an example, but really if one of them wanted anything and the other one wanted the opposite of that, the world we're talking about would host a contradiction that we don't observe. But what if they're working together? But then flanderization, I believe, occurs. If a clone of Josh were here next to me, would there be any difference between the clone and me, minus our circumstances of birth, obviously? I would say that you could effectively say that I exist as two different persons. So if there are more than one maximally great being, we could surmise that they are working together in such a way in which they are behaving as one, and therefore there is only truly one maximally great being. How do we know a God would be multi-personal? Well, because aspects of neutral-making properties require it. If God is a loving God, is he a loving God in all possible worlds? And if so, would he be loving in the worlds where only God exists? God cannot be maximally loving or hateful in a possible world where no one exists. And because humans are contingent beings, we would have to accept that such a world could exist. Hence, God must be multi-personal. Well, what if I applied this argument to a being that can beat the maximally great being in an arm wrestle? This is a ridiculous premise that comes from a lack of understanding of the axioms. To restate, if something has a property to the maximal extent, that is the equivalent of having all of that property to begin with. And that would be the end of this video. In my next video, I'll be talking more along the lines of string theory, the 10 dimensions as proposed by the multiple worlds theory, and how that might help us envision how a maximally great being exists. Thank you for watching.